Welcome to our third plenary of the conference. I'm really pleased to welcome our four speakers. I'm going to introduce them in a minute, but we've also done this in conjunction with UK in a Changing Europe, who many of you will have seen the stand, Alex and Jannike talking about it. If you don't know them, as a place to get an audience with practitioners, the public, it's a really good place, and if you pick up one of the leaflets, there are more down at the bottom as well. It's really good, and have a talk with the two of them because they're very helpful in what they do. And in various ways, we have different connections, and I'll talk about that as we go. Also, one of the great things about UK and Changing Europe is that their name is almost as hard to remember as whatever UKiCE stands for. In this conference, we talked a lot about crisis, permacrisis, polycrisis. This topic is one in which I think the word crisis shouldn't occur. No, maybe. European political community is something which has come through in the last couple of years since Macron's speech in May last year in the wake of the invasion of Ukraine. And opens up a space for a discussion about whether this is a new kind of model that has value. And we wanted to interrogate that because I know we've had sort of informal discussions about it, but you know, the kind of a substantial degree of skepticism around it. But I think with the four speakers we have, hopefully we can work through that kind of discussion a bit more. And we look forward to kind of having the debate with you. So in order of closer to me, further from me. First of all, we have Jannike Wachowiak from UK and Changing Europe, whose background is in European policy and UK EU relations. We have Cleo Davies from Warwick University, recently moved, who's also working in similar kind of space and thinking about the UK's bilateral relations with European partners. Is it Ben? Ben, yes. Ben Tonra from UCD, who is an expert in all things foreign policy, thinking about the EU side. And then at the end of the row, we have Richard Whitman from the University of Kent, who again is a specialist in foreign and security policy. And I think between them, they bring both academic insight, but also practitioner experience connection into various communities. So we're going to take a round of questions that we're going to get some opinions on, and then we're going to feedback to you as we go along. So the first question, I'm going to start with who looks most scared. Richard looks least scared because he hasn't paid attention. Is the question, what's the added value of European political community? You know, is it something that adds something that was missing from what there was before? Richard, we're going to come down.
I'll sit here if I may. Thank you very much. And I think all of us feel that this is an examination question for which we have far too much time to answer. So my apologies in advance. So European political community, of course, for those who are grey ahead, EPC stands for European Political Cooperation. I don't think the new EPC is going to result in the same degree of success as the old EPC did. Maybe that's controversial. So what is EPC, European Political Cooperation? Well, for me, it resembles a diplomatic flash mob of 47 country leaders turning up for a collective gathering, setting aside the cost to the planet in terms of jet fuel to bring them together. I do think that it has some value, and that's not where I thought I would end up in terms of preparing for this session. And I think the minimum value that it has is obviously getting together a group of heads of state and government, but I think as importantly, building a network of Sherpas and officials that are not necessarily plugged in together within the same network when you think of the grouping of countries, and sort of building relationships and building that familiarity with working together where they may not have that kind of intimacy in other fora. And of course, for those who are interested in how the integration process was built, will be familiar with the idea. There is some value to be had just by the act of bringing people together in that way. So I do think, you know, by its existence, it does have some value, but also I think in another sense, which is, I know others are going to talk about the substance in terms of perhaps some of the things that have been discussed. I think that on the margins, rather than substantive sessions, you could also, and have been, substantive value as well. If you look at the first gathering, Armenia and Azerbaijan were brought together on the margins of the meeting to engage in a process to try and resolve their bilateral difficulties. And that was something of value. Of course, it could have happened in another place, but I think there is the fact that it was round and about that forum. So you could think about possibly in the future as being something not unlike the opening of the annual session of the UN General Assembly, you know, which brings together a lot of people in the same town, and a lot of business can be done in a setting which is possible to have folk together and to derive some value from it. And there is, of course, also some value in having a forum at the moment, which is basically all the European states which are not on the naughty step, you know, so basically not having Russia and Belarus. And although, of course, there are a range of views within that group of 47 on how to deal with Russia, how to deal with war, it obviously stands as a forum in which there is an opportunity to at least signal that this represents potentially a different view on Europe and how Europe might be organized. Finally, I think to me, this was one of the great things about having it. It solved the question as to what to get Mr. Macron for Christmas, which is that he got the forum that he wanted. So we now know that and even get the most demanding of Europe's leaders something that they really covet, and they get to take home as a great win. We're on to barriers in a while, so for me, that would be a sort of initial positive side of the balance sheet.
Thanks very much, Richard. Well, in preliminary conversations prior to this panel, I had been the designated Pollyanna. I was the one who was to come in with the positivity and how this all was supposed to be really, really good and forward looking. And now Richard's trumped me. I suppose then I'll take a more pragmatic position. And in talking about EPC, it seems to me that it's the child of two countervailing dynamics. One dynamic is related to differentiated integration, and the second dynamic is related to geopolitics. And I'm not entirely sure that the member states have decided what role or what dynamic is to predominate within the European political community, because it's a child of Brexit and Ukraine. A child of Brexit in terms of, you know, this is a long-standing French ambition and others to have some forum, some means of differentiating integration for states who are aspire towards EU membership but can't make it, won't be allowed to make it into the EU. So some forum for that. A forum for the UK to bilaterally interact with the EU and its member states, which is not just UK at one table and EU on the other table, but also a child of Ukraine insofar as a forum for geopolitical conversation amongst European democracies. And therein, I think, lays the problem as to the added value, because there does have to be, I think, a decision as to which function the European political community serves, i.e., is it to be a mini UN for Europe, as some people have described it, potentially even with a European Security Council, if we're going to fulfill, you know, Mr. Macron's wildest dreams of success, or is it, and the analogy here I draw is with NATO's Partnership for Peace, is the Europe to be a 2-for-1. It is both a preparatory stage, an enabler of ultimate membership of the European Union for some states, Or is it simply a framework for individual European states who are not members of the European Union to have a relationship with the European Union? And as I say, those, to my mind, are the two different forms of added value the European political community offers. But I think the contradictions within that dynamic and the decisions yet to be taken on what the European political community is designed to do have yet to be taken.
Thank you. Right. So the first question, yes, that was about the positive. So Richard, very good with metaphors, and I liked the flash mob. He coined another one, a large-scale speed dating exercise, and I'm very proud with mine, a large-scale brainstorming exercise. And I think that's what came out of listening to Emmanuel Macron's press conference after the first iteration of the EPC in Prague in the October of 2022. And he lists 6 areas that came out. And then an afterthought was number 7, a nod to the Prime Minister of the UK. He'd forgotten migration. So I'll just list them for those that have never heard of them. And I'm sure, Jannike, you may go in perhaps to more detail about it. The first one was to protect essential infrastructures. And it was in the wake of what had happened with Nord Stream 1. So there was that context. Things happened so quickly that I had even forgotten about that. And actually, that is something that needs to be discussed beyond the EU 27. The second one was, cyber criminality attacks. And interestingly, he mentioned the fact that the leaders had mentioned not only Russia, but Iran too, which puts geography back into it a lot. A third one was what was to be done with the areas of the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea, and the Caucasus more generally, so general discussions right now. A fourth one was suggested by President Zelensky, and it was about creating, contributing to a resilience fund for rebuilding Ukraine. A fifth one was an integrated strategy for energy, and he mentioned the fact that both Norway and Azerbaijan, amongst others, are gas-producing countries, and that they were able to sit down and share that experience. Linked it with the idea of reducing dependency and increasing diversification. And here, because I'm a boring academic, I have some figures from the European Research Council on Foreign Affairs. Apparently, I think it's 27 of the 110 energy bilateral or energy agreements signed by the EU since Russia's invasion of Ukraine are with countries that have attended the EPC out of 110, 27. And then the last one, and that's quite an interesting one, was a common policy for youth in Europe. And I don't know if that's been carried through, but he mentioned 3 states in particular who had been keen to put that forward: Albania, Serbia, and Ireland. So something to do with creating a space for universities to collaborate and so on. So I think I won't go further than that. I would also add one point to what Richard was saying on the positives. It's equal to equal at this point. So there's no hierarchy amongst those that attend. And that is really one of the strengths at this stage. How sustainable that is as we go into any form of formalization, we'll see. But I think that was noted, and it was Edi Rama, the Prime Minister of Albania, who emphasized that in his statement around the one in Prague. Thanks.
Thank you, Cleo. I'm now less worried about the added value of the EPC, but more worried about the added value of my contribution after these 3 very good contributions already, but I'll try my best. So I think the European political community fulfills an immediate need for a pan-European, flexible, informal, and egalitarian forum that no existing organization would have been able to fulfill, at least not as quickly. Macron wanted to get together all European democracies to discuss big strategic challenges. And there's a number of rationales for it. I think there was a feeling that the Western Balkans maybe didn't have as much exposure to the EU, and there was a growing influence from China and Russia in those countries. Related to that, there is also the feeling that the neighborhood policy maybe isn't as successful as initially hoped, and that it's important for the EU to tighten the ties with those countries. And equally with the new candidate countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and also Georgia as a prospective candidate country. And then, of course, there is the UK. And we know that Macron has been quite keen post-Brexit to create a forum to socialize the Brits and so that they don't lose touch with their European partners, and also vice versa for the European capitals to have a forum where they can meet their British counterpart. And he had various proposals in that regard in the last years. European Security Council was another one, which was not successful. So I guess the question then is, why do we need a new organization to do all of these things? And I think the added value of the EPC is the level of participants. So it's a meeting place for political leaders. And of course, we have lots of other organizations in Europe, like the Council of Europe, the OSCE, which are important forums in which Europeans and others are working together. But what is lacking, or what has been lacking, is a regular exchange at the level of heads of state and government of the EU and their European partners, where they can meet once or twice a year and discuss these types of strategic challenges. And it's also an opportunity for them to build familiarity and to build trust. I think related to that, the advantage of creating a new organizational forum as opposed to using an existing one is that the EPC doesn't come with any historic baggage. So it's basically a blank canvas for the members to decide what they want to do with it. So unlike the OSCE, where Russia is a member and can veto all sorts of things, the EPC doesn't bring that type of baggage. And as Cleo and Richard, I think, mentioned, I think it's important to emphasize that it's a form of equals, and not just in terms of decision making, but also as opposed to the enlargement process, it doesn't come with the notion of conditionality. And I think that is also important. As a geopolitical forum, or forum to discuss geopolitical challenges, it has an interest-driven character, which is quite interesting, I think, because it's obviously also an expression of solidarity with Ukraine, but it is not a human rights organization. It is also not, it is not a place to scrutinize each other's track record when it comes to the rule of law, for example, as it is rather the case when you look at the Council of Europe or other organizations. So it's more based about the adherence to principles, maybe, rather than values, like principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, cooperation, rather than war and conflict. And last but not least, as Richard mentioned, it has the potential to help navigate regional conflicts in Europe. But I think it also has maybe there's an opportunity to strengthen and maybe help repair bilateral ties between the EU and the UK to a certain extent, at least. And we've seen that the first meeting in Prague, in particular, had a positive effect on Franco-British relations. And there was a joint statement by Liz Truss back then and Emmanuel Macron, in which they kind of committed to reviving bilateral ties between the two countries, and also committed to hold the first Franco-British summit in 5 years, which then took place in March this year and was an important step for the bilateral relationships between those two countries. So I think there is something to say about an added value for EU-UK relations, even though that comes with a lot of caveats, which we can maybe discuss at a later point. Thank you.
I'm impressed. When we were discussing this by email beforehand, these four didn't think they had anything positive to say, and we've managed 20 minutes. And I'm going to give them the opportunity to say what I think they thought they said, which were the problems with this. You know, we can see that there's a space, we can see there are values, but clearly there's a question about how much this is a product of the times, as you're saying, Ben, this tension between Brexit, Ukraine, that, you know, is this just a work of a moment that, you know, it was good for then, for Prague, for Chisinau, but we will run out of steam once we've kind of dealt with the low-hanging fruit. So the question, it kind of pulls together the other two questions that I asked you is, you know, is this a sustainable model for managing European relations? And what are the barriers, you know, specifically, operationally? I think you've touched on some of these kind of things. And I'm going to let you, we're going reverse order so that you get to get dibs on the insights and everyone has to agree with you rather than agreeing with Richard. Okay.
Thank you, Simon. I think the first barrier that I see is kind of the decision that needs to be made about the purpose of the organization and kind of the underpinning institutional structure or framework. So when the first summit was about to happen in Prague, there were quite a lot of kind of think tank pieces and analysts who were writing about what shape this new political animal might take. And I think there were probably two visions or two school of thoughts, broadly speaking. And the first one was more a communitaire model and the second one more an intergovernmental model. So the communitaire model is probably best exemplified by a paper that was published by the Bruegel Institute and by Meyer, Pisani, Schwarzer and Vallée. And they had this idea to give the European Commission the role of the Secretariat, to have a small budget and participation criteria as well as an exclusion process. And they think that eventually the EPC should be based on a treaty between the EU, its members and non-members. On the, kind of the other side is the intergovernmental approach, so a forum for states and only a very either no or very light touch structures underpinning that. At the moment, it looks like the intergovernmental vision is the one that's being endorsed by members of the EPC. I think the barrier or the issue that I see is that there is a clear trade-off between keeping things informal, but at the same time being able to deliver things. So if you institutionalize too much and too early, you immediately have some very difficult questions to answer. So if you have a secretariat, where do you put it? Who pays for it? Also, some members might not like the idea of institutions at all. The UK is probably going to be one of those, particularly if it's related to EU institutions. But if you don't have a structure at all, then there's a big question mark about follow-up. So what do you have then other than a talking shop that meets once or twice a year? So I think there's a very fine line to tread for EPC members. And there's still a big question mark about around that. I think another potential barrier is that the concerns about the EPC as a permanent waiting room for the candidate countries could resurface. Obviously, that was a concern that a lot of members had immediately after Macron launched the idea, and there was a lot of hostility from Eastern European countries in particular. I think he's been able to kind of reassure them for now, but I think if there were to be sluggish progress in the accession talks, that could cause a backlash and a spillover effect into the efficiency and the functioning of the EPC. And we know that the Commission will publish its enlargement report in October this year. There will be European Council in December. So I think, yeah, there's definitely a risk there. And another potential barrier that I see is that there might just be a lack of political will and interest over time. So the lack of an institutional framework, which in many ways is also a strength, really means that the heads of state or government need to be the ones who are driving this. And some of them might lose interest. So the UK, for example, might lose interest if it becomes too institutionalized or too close to the EU institutions. Some of the candidate countries might lose interest if it looks too much like a substitute or if it looks like a substitute to enlargement. And there's also a danger that countries, particularly the ones who are hosting the summits, might not make it a priority or might be distracted by kind of domestic issues that take over. If we look at Spain, still pretty, at the moment, pretty distracted by the fallout from the election. Then the UK next year, we don't know when there's going to be a general election in the UK. So it could be that the EPC forum falls into a period where the parties are already in campaign mode. And if there are going to be more summits after the fourth one, and they stick to that pattern of EU member states who hold the council presidency and then non-EU member states, we can assume that the one after that is going to be hosted by Hungary, and that might bring its own issues with it. I think the last point to say in terms of barriers, I think it's kind of a self-inflicted barrier almost, might be that the members, but also people who analyze it, might have inflated expectations about what this is and what it might deliver. And that maybe it might be useful to give the EPC some time to consolidate at leaders level before building or involving structures, and that there needs to be some honesty, I guess, and expectation management about what this is and what it actually can do. And with that, I pass on.
Thank you. Well, actually, it builds on quite well with some of the comparisons that have been made with some of the formal international organizations, trying to work out where this could go. You mentioned also institutionalization and the difference between going for a supranational way of going about it, treaty-based, or an intergovernmental one. And I thought I would bring in some of the comparative literature on what is an emerging, apparently, area of study, which is around informal international organizations. And I'm referring in particular to the work of Charles Rogers, a book 2020, The Origins of Informality, where he makes the case that the legal foundation of global governance are shifting, and that as we see a kind of slowing or plateauing in the creation of treaty-based international organizations, i.e. formal international organizations, in parallel, governments, member states have opted for the informal form of international organization to cope and manage global governance issues. So the EPC has many features that actually correspond with this, and there's a couple of concepts that derive from this idea of an informal international organization that may hint at how a governance structure may develop. And the first one is indirect governance. So that means that governance activities are carried out by intermediaries. So there's no secretariat. We're thinking typically of examples such as the G20, which is hailed as a success, also created as a result of a transnational, well, global financial crisis. Others have existed for a long time. They do have a form of secretariat, Bank of International Settlement, there's loads. Sorry. And in this case, intermediary indirect governance means that you rely on others to carry out your agenda. And there have been suggestions in many of these think tank papers and blogs produced, and I'll give one. Emeritus Professor Derek Watt, who makes a suggestion of using this trio as a way of coordinating an agenda. And over time, so there's a trio. They agreed in Prague that the next three, who would host the next three. Now, Jannike has mentioned the challenges around what may come up with if it continues to be supported by the trio, the presidency, the member state of the EU that is exercising the rotating presidency of the council, and that would fall with Hungary. But that does mean that going forward, the UK, who will be hosting the last of the one we know is going to take place, would want to look into how that trio goes forward. And one of the outcomes to look out for is whether the UK manages, the summit in the UK, manages to ensure that there is another trio going forward. And that could be a benchmark, not only for the UK's success, but also for continued convening of it. I think even if there's just that commitment, it would be a success. at this stage. The other concept is orchestration, and that is how informal IOs enlist their intermediaries to carry out their objectives. There, it can be ad hoc, and it can depend on what the objectives are. So you mentioned the Commission as being one of the intermediaries that could be enlisted on an ad hoc basis to carry out something, but other organizations could also be that are not EU institutions. The reason why I mention the EU institutions specifically is that they have found that the preferred intermediaries they do enlist, the G20 and many other examples, are formal international organizations that have a secretariat. But there may be other examples of, yeah. So those were the things I would leave you with. Yeah.
Okay, EPC, should it have a secretariat, and what role for the Troika? I'm having some severe flashbacks here, people. Leaving that aside, for me, the overall barrier to the success and sustainability of EPC is suspicion. Suspicion as to motive, suspicion as to role, and suspicion as to the purpose and function of institutional infrastructure. And I'd like to have a chat about, you know, is EPC arriving without any baggage? Perhaps EPC has arrived with no baggage, but a hell of a lot of people are bringing baggage to the party, and in particular, French baggage. I think there is profound and legitimate suspicion that EPC is full-on designed to complicate, delay, and make more difficult EU enlargement, or offer a substitute to EU enlargement. And I think that is rampant in the Western Balkans and elsewhere in Europe. So that, as I say, comes from a long French tradition. We've already seen, I mean, it's almost pedestrian to talk about it, but nonetheless, we've also already seen a row over the logo for EPC. The British had through some kind of a mini tantrum that there would be a logo. So there's no logo for European political cooperation. Again, you know, the baggage that is brought to this is extraordinary. And I think really for EPC going forward, if it is to have a future, particularly, and we haven't even mentioned, you know, the overlap between the agenda, let's say, of the Council of Europe. I mean, how much of this agenda, ostensibly for EPC, could the Council of Europe engage in quite happily? But leaving that aside, I think really the issue for the EPC going forward is whether or not it is sustainable as a geopolitical forum for Europe. I think in that role, it has potential if it remains flexible, if it remains under-institutionalized. But I think the moment we start getting into debates about secretariats and rotating troikas and decision-making processes and voting rights, etc., I think we then get into a whole different ballgame, and I think it will be unsustainable if those are the kinds of debates that we start getting engaged in.
I mean, all of those are absolutely fantastic interventions. So I'll probably say the same thing, but a little more prosaically, I suspect. I mean, it strikes me as a very sort of 20th century thinking in a 21st century world in terms of, you know, creating this kind of arrangement or gathering, and then to get into a discussion which, you know, think tankers are really happy to do around, you know, whether it should be a full fat or low fat organization in terms of the, you know, the institutional structure and the arrangements that you keep the show on the road. So I think in a way it you know, the starting point is unfortunate because it's starting to suffer a bit from a sort of chronic lack of imagination, and that one's already into those problems fairly soon. Because I mean the essential problem, and I think Ben put this nicely earlier on, is that, you know, the space that we need occupied is how do we govern the international relations of Europe, and in particular, how do we think about arrangements that suit Ukraine's position as fulcrum when it comes to security, economy, and so on, and so on. And do we need another institution to do that, or do we just need to think about the arrangements that we already have, which are obviously long-standing, and there's been all sorts of institutional learning processes. I guess in summary, for me, the problems are the European, the political, and the community. bits as it stands. You know, what does it signal in terms of what configuration of Europe we're talking about, when the only people who are beyond the political pale to be members are Russia and Belarus. So there is, I think, a problem, if you like, with the ambition in terms of what kind of Europe does this represent, or what, as an organization, it tells us about what collectively the states might want to do as Europeans, because probably those things could be done better elsewhere, whether it's security or removing barriers to trade and so on. I think the political bit, which is a problem for me, is that it has the sort of Groucho Marx problem. You know, do you really want to be a member of this club when everybody is allowed to be a member of the club? I mean, the cost of entry is far too low, I would suggest, if it's going to be a meaningful organization. And does it allow for e-Pexit? Firstly, here, you know, you need to, for somebody to leave, there needs to be a high cost, perhaps, for deviating from the organization, because I suspect that not too far along the road, some of the disputes that we've been talking about are probably going to lead to diplomatic tantrums. And states will either put on the handbrake or decide not to participate. And that, in a way, gets to the sort of heart of the problem for me, which is what kind of community is this, or what it's supposed to be. It's obviously an imagined community at the moment, the product of Mr. Macron's imagination in the first instance, and that's not a bad thing, perhaps, in terms of thinking in that way. But for me, the sort of fundamental problem in a way for the EU is that it seems to be a very striking way of not thinking and acting geopolitically in terms of creating such a large organization for indeterminate purposes, and doesn't really solve the problem of how you deal with members and non-members in any kind of convincing way, because, you know, the organization could disappear tomorrow. And it would just be an exhibit in the museum of failed European diplomatic initiatives, and an interesting footnote for historians, rather than, you know, being a project that was something substantive, interesting, potentially useful, but failed as a consequence of, you know, whatever you know, sort of political process or external factor that was at work. So, you know, I think that's you know, it's very nice to have. It's, for all the positive reasons that we gave in the first set of answers, it seems to be, it's interesting. I suspect that the problem, essentially, if we take the UK, is that it's sort of the EU, but it's not an instrument of the EU. And if it became an instrument of the EU, then it'd be very unattractive. So thinking parochially, you know, what is in there in that space that would be interesting for the UK? And of course, what the UK really wants is an E2, not an EPC. It wants, you know, to be treated as an equal partner by the EU, as Brendan Sims put it. So the EPC is an irrelevance in that take on how the UK could connect to the EU. So I don't think it's really going to satisfy, you know, sort of the ambitions that the UK probably has for what it thinks about, you know, the structures of Europe, and really just defers the moment, I think, of thinking about what kind of a Europe we may have to deal with. Back to my first point about what kind of governance arrangements are going to suit the order of the challenges that we have, and how far we're able to retool the existing organizations to meet those.
Thank you very much. I think the kind of the mixture of the picture, I think, really highlights the tensions that are there, that the ambiguity is both a strength and a weakness. And, you know, in collapsing things, we might gain, but we might also lose. I'd like to throw it open to the audience for questions, comments, queries. Someone wants to do some running? Oh, I'm going to. So we'll get 3 questions. So we're going to start off with.
Thanks very much, Martin Bond. Sorry if I come back to the geopolitical end of this debate. It's an awful lot of effort and energy from the Quai d'Orsay if it's going to be a footnote in history. I think there's a great deal more to it than that, and I think there's a lot of baggage has certainly come with the French. It's not an exact rerun of the Fouché plan, far from it, but it is the same concentration on finding the partners who matter out of the vast number of states in Europe who are being treated, technically at least, on egalitarian terms. It's a framework within which you can find the big players. And the big players are the concentration for the Quai d'Orsay, for the French president. That's the main concern, is lining up, and I think about E2, who is not the structure he's looking for. The structure will be one where more Britain are outside in Europe. And it's very clear if you look around either by GDP or by population, more likely who the big players will be. It's still a bit flexible, but it's quite clear that Turkey is problematic inside of that. And it's pretty clear that Ukraine is a big player inside it, assuming the war goes the way the West wants. And then the biggest player of all, who's not mentioned at all in this, is Washington and America. What do the Americans think of the EPC?
Thanks, Shane from University of Limerick. I'm wondering, kind of building on that, is one Child of Ukraine kind of as a broader forum for kind of European security, is one potential benefit the lack of involvement of the US in case, or there's concerns about, depending on who's in the White House, that they could be an unreliable or kind of actor or unreliable ally. So it provides an alternative forum, NATO, and for what it's beyond kind of military security.
Thank you. Maybe this is just an obvious comment, but if you look at a Venn diagram of the membership of the Council of Europe and the membership of the European political community, they're almost exactly identical. There's a couple of microstates that are excluded from the EPC. It seems to me there's an old-fashioned argument to be made about using institutions that already exist, that have so the Council of Europe, it exists, it pre-exists the European Union, and it embodies a set of values: democracy promotion, rule of law promotion, human rights. It has a body of institutions, including a human rights court and, notably, a parliamentary assembly. So it doesn't involve, it's not just a summit, a vessel for summits. So why not revitalize an existing institution rather than creating a brand new one?
You want to go first, Ben?
That last comment, I agree 100%. The logic escapes me. I suppose in reality, it is again, and we come back to Paris and we come back to the Elysee. It is trying to solve two problems simultaneously. I think, to be honest, and coming to Martin's point, I think the primary objective here is precisely that, strategic, the French ambition for a European geostrategic voice. I think the instant the French propose something analogous to a European Security Council, the whole endeavor will collapse, because for all the other member states, for all the other participant states, that will be objectionable. If it's not egalitarian, why am I sitting here? I'm not sitting here to be told by Germany, France, the UK, and or Turkey, and or Ukraine what I should or shouldn't be doing. I think, is the US paying attention? No, I don't think that the US is paying a blind bit of attention to the European political community. It's tough enough to get the US to focus on the European Union, never mind the European political community. So no, I don't think this is a factor in US thinking. As I say again, the only utility is as a flexible form of summitry, which I presume in the Council of Europe they don't have that particular echelon, that particular line, but it would be so much easier to simply have a summit at the Council of Europe level with all of the infrastructure to give that meaning. And why that's not the choice, I just don't know.
Maybe just to touch on the two comments really about the US and the OSCE, which are connected, because of course the US is not in the EPC but is in the OSCE, and obviously the OSCE membership is much broader, so it's not a like for like swap in terms of even the configuration of states which are brought together. And I know that we've had some earlier discussion in the conference about the role and function of the OSCE, and obviously that's an organization which had performed an incredibly important function in terms of the institutional order of Europe, which we've lost. So my kind of optimism about what you could do about the EPC is to think of it akin to a SPAC, for those who are familiar with speculating on the stock market, a special purpose acquisition company, where you create a company in paper, which you use to buy another company and take it to market. I think we create the European political EPC structure to then basically reverse engineer a takeover of other organizations that involve Russia, but just to take on the role and function of those. In other words, how you deal with the Russia problem is in a way to take on those other organizations in another format, so you get around some of the problems we have. But that's probably far too complicated a way to do the sort of thing that a think tanker or an academic might think up because it sounds smart. But the practicality is obviously quite difficult to do. I mean, the essential problem we have is that we've got a couple of organizations like the OSCE and the Council of Europe, where we need the role and function performed by those organizations and the strengths that those organizations have and have contributed to the governance of Europe. But we don't have those organizations functioning in the manner that they could or should, not just because of Russia, but Russia is really essentially the primary reason why those organizations are not available as part of the complicated governance structure that we have in Europe. And how are we going to solve that problem? And is this the way that we're going to solve that problem? Probably not, because it's a bigger problem to solve. But is there something in here that we could use to help us to solve that problem? And it's obviously early days, and it's difficult to think what that might be. But we also have to think then about how the US fits into this story. If we're seeing organizations like the OSCE, right, and what we do with the STARMs and so on are a part of that. So, I think just by having created it, it raises a lot more questions about how you might want to think about the order of the international relations of Europe and how we manage it in this new context of Russia and the obligations and responsibilities we'll have for Ukraine. So it's on the one hand, it's a big idea, but it's not big enough in a way for the order of the problem or the challenge that we face. But can it be turned into a structure that could do that? And I think all of us in different ways are sort of suggesting, well, too early to tell.
I'll just say one word again about the importance of the informality of it. So addressing your point about there are already institutions and so on. The work, sorry, going back to the academic writings on this, but the work, again, of Rogers on this, the reason why member states choose informality, or states, not member states, pardon my state there, states choose informality is mainly determined by domestic constraints. So there's something about being visible at a summit of a formal international organization for some of those member states would be a problem, and thinking of the UK. So at a political level and in a very heightened, visible, attention is focused on the leaders and so on. There is a function for this informality, and it drives states' decision to go for informal international organizations over formalization. That doesn't make the formal institutions of IOs redundant. Oh, that's been a debate, yeah, all over the last 3 days, but just wanted to emphasize that. And that may be a contingent to the political context of the day, but the domestic constraints here also may play out.
Yeah, just to kind of echo what Cleo said about the importance of the informality of the EPC as opposed to the Council of Europe, which obviously comes with institutions and also comes with the ECHR court. So and kind of the idea of rule of law and kind of baggage when you look at kind of back the history of the Council of Europe with Azerbaijan, but also just Russia being a now expelled member, but still a former member. So I think that's kind of even though now a lot of the EPC members are bringing some of their baggage into the EPC, the Council of Europe already has a lot of its own baggage, I guess. I guess Macron also just has a proclivity for big new ideas. So I guess it's also in part just his preference that it's kind of playing out here. Just a very quick word on the US. I agree that the US is currently not very interested in the EPC. What's interesting is when you look back at when Mitterrand suggested the European Confederation in '89, that back then one of the reasons why that failed, and they actually only managed to meet once in Prague as well, but there was no second meeting. So in that way, the EPC is already successful, one could say. But back then, actually, so France did not want the US to be a member of the European Confederation, which was an issue for Germany and lots of the Eastern partners who wanted that kind of close transatlantic link. And the US as well felt that it was kind of being pushed out. So back then, that was one of the reasons why it failed, but I don't think that is something that we're seeing with the EPC now.
I just wanted to add to this point, going back to the French case. We've been focusing on Macron's brainchild, or what was it, your words, or his wildest dreams of success. I'll let everyone speculate. But actually there are, public opinion in France is not pro-enlargement. So that going back to this domestic constraints, it is also not just his own, he's actually having to deal with the fact that what the French don't want, and so again drives the informality. And that was
again, we're kind of picking up the challenges and tensions between small p politics and delivery of effective governance. In some ways, it feels a bit like a Rorschach test that we see what we want to see, and it's not that there's any intrinsic meaning to it. One thing that's striking is, again, we're thinking about institutional evolution and adaptation in Europe in post-war period, and we've got endless examples of institutions that have started, failed, gone into abeyance, and then come back or be reformulated in different situations and contexts. So again, we might think about this, even if it seems to not go very far at this stage, whether there's something that can be preserved to be brought out of the cupboard. But again, that lack of even a logo, oh my God, how are they going to cope? Have they got a Twitter account? Actually, no, they don't. I know somebody else has an account about it. That can you bring something that doesn't exist in any material form back into being? More questions, Bridget. I'll run up. No. Yeah, but the people online won't be able to.
So we've talked both positive case for it and the barriers, but I would start at a much lower. Harm can it do? In other words, a doctor, don't make the patient sicker. Make sure that you don't do any harm. And I can't see that the EPC can do any harm whatsoever. It will not be an anti-chamber for candidate countries. the EU accession process has rhythms and processes and procedures of its own that will continue. I think it won't prevent, for example, the EU with its energy policy in any way whatsoever. I think at a basic level, it's not a major change. And simply survival for as long as the government actually, and then it loses relevance, they stop going. That's what's going to happen. And then it'll be less relevant. But so I think for me, the basic the EPC is kind of do harm. And I can see no evidence that it is going to damage in any way all of the challenges that Europe faces. It may not contribute to solving them, but it won't make them worse. And I think that's a government meeting to discuss is no bad thing.
Thank you. Anyone else? We'll go to Martin. Why am I running around? Why am I running is actually the bigger question. Why aren't I just walking?
Martin Dangerfield from Wolverhampton University. It's just a remark on the question of why not use the Council of Europe. And if you were to ask that question in Pristina, the answer would be because Kosovo is not a member of the Council of Europe or a member of the OSCE. But thanks to the Moldovan government issuing special visas, Kosovo is allowed to attend the summit in Moldova. And I think I'm correct in saying there was a side meeting with Olaf Scholz and maybe Charles Michel and the presidents of and the representatives of Serbia and Kosovo. So I think inclusivity in an organization like this in sort of times of nervousness for all states, let alone small states, is probably a positive, without me wanting to make too much of a positive case. And I think since actually the end of the Cold War, there've been lots of small kind of unnoticed regional organizations that have sprung up in Europe, a lot of them involving summitry. And these have always been sort of more appreciated by the states that weren't members of the EU or NATO. So, and I think you can just detect by looking at the Moldovan website the enthusiasm for it and the importance to those countries of hosting these events and being equals on the stage. So that's just really a remark to the Council of Europe issue and a couple of extra points. Thanks.
Ragnar Weiland, University of Trondheim. I just want to make a brief follow-up to the last 2 points. So it's not just that generally or it doesn't do harm if heads of states and government meet, and that it matters for a state like Moldova that they meet there. It also matters for the rest of Europe that suddenly Moldova is in the spotlight, right? I mean, the amount of attention a state that, let's face it, the majority of Western European citizens, even fairly well informed, were probably not even aware of its existence, right? And the fact that suddenly you have a major, suddenly some very important people meet there. There's lots of media coverage. There are lots of documentaries suddenly about Moldova and the situation in Moldova. That matters as well, right? So independent of what kind of an entity it is that meets, that the fact that it meets in a place like Moldova, that might make a difference as well. Thanks.
Whilst I'm up here, anyone else? Okay, right. I'm going to stroll down. Who wants to take this one, please? Jannike.
I guess just to comment on the comments, on Brigitte, I have to say that I agree with what you've said. I also think that for it to be useful and to have the added value that we described in our responses to the first question, it doesn't have to go on forever. If this is just a temporary forum where leaders meet as long as they find it useful, then I think that is an a success in and of itself. I think it can be, if it remains at such an informal level, it can maybe be more of a complement to kind of existing institutions and structures and processes that we already have, rather than kind of becoming or having the ambition to become its own fully fledged international organization, which seems quite unlikely and would bring lots of issues with it. Yeah, I agree that I think it is already, we're going to probably see at least 4 summits and maybe more, and that is a positive development. And I also don't think that it will do any harm. And I would also agree with the comment that it's been positive for Moldova, just kind of in terms of being in the spotlight and being able to make the case for certain things, and that maybe the EPC can in some ways be kind of an incubator for projects at bilateral and minilateral level, or it can be an accelerator for things that are maybe already in the pipeline, and it's just an opportunity for those countries to kind of use a forum to exert some pressure. It's not entirely clear to me how related it is to the EPC, but I guess one example is the agreement between Moldova and the EU on lower roaming charges for Moldova, and kind of bringing Moldova into the EU's space in that area. So I guess it could just also be positive in that way, that it's an opportunity to kind of accelerate projects in that way.
I'll just say one thing, and we had a discussion before, yeah, I'm very much in agreement, but then listening to it, I think, well, and that speaks to what I think Ben was saying, it could do harm if it gives the EU a way of not talking about what it really needs to talk about. And if it becomes just a performative instrument and it doesn't address these geopolitical concerns. So yesterday we heard Sven Biscott talk about what you do with Georgia in this context, the geopolitics, the geography of it and so on. And it's not that it would do harm, but how does the EU then not just use this as window dressing for addressing some of the real geopolitical problems or security problems that they have?
Just to have a bit of fun with Bridget's comment, I just find it difficult to believe that the ANARC in the Elysee sat down in a small room and said, let's design an organization that will do no harm, that will allow Pristina to attend and can put Moldova on the map. So to my mind, it's the managing of the expectations. And so if the institution, has, like Google, do no harm written into its DNA, fine, let's have this flexible institution that can pop up when and as is necessary. But I'm just, again, come back to that word suspicion, that's not what's behind this initiative.
I mean, I think it is a really interesting question, whether the act of having the exercise, and particularly now having it timetabled and having it as a date in the diary for heads of state and government in and of itself is a good, in terms of particularly when you think about diplomacy working towards that moment, particularly bilateral or minilateral gatherings, and you use that as a nice hook. And I don't think that should be undervalued. I mean, I think that is a good and useful thing to do. And I think its weakness is also its strength, in the sense because, it's not an EU structure. And as we've already heard, I mean, that does give it some appeal. And I think, the equality that exists in terms of participation is also a good thing. But I mean, we've also got lots of examples of where things do run out of road, and even in the EU. I mean, we were in a previous session on the Indo-Pacific strategy, in the second meeting of ministers of that forum, there was a downgrading at the ministerial level of those who attended. So I think actually the real challenge for whoever is the host is to inject enough excitement, dynamism, and prospect of achievement by attending for it to work well. And there again, we can learn from presidencies in the past, the way that EU presidencies were great animating exercises sometimes for initiatives. And particularly in my case, I'll be optimistic about why the UK wants to put in, I think, frankly, because it's part of the project of the UK's diplomatic return to Europe, shall we put it that way, in terms of carving out a bit more of a niche for itself. And also, we can't quite be certain that even if it doesn't quite work out what its special sauce is today, it won't necessarily find it tomorrow. I mean, the first McDonald's opened in 1954, the special sauce wasn't invented until 1968, and look where McDonald's is now. But more seriously, I mean, the structure and the fact that you've created something that brings together those states in a very, very difficult time, I think is in and of itself probably positive. And the fact that there hasn't been too much so far that's tripped people up. And as we know with Twitter/X, logoization can get you into all sorts of trouble. So it's probably not a bad idea not to have a logo, frankly. And the UK does not have a good track record when it comes to logos and EU presidencies in the past. So let's not wish that on the UK as well in trying to devise one that doesn't cause a bit of a storm in the teacup.
I'd just like to add something. And one specific irritant of the leaders attending was Rishi Sunak trying to push his domestic agenda around migration. So that does signal that they are taking that seriously, that you're not to bring to this space overtly or too unashamedly some of your domestic agendas, because there was pushback there. So I think that's an indication that perhaps there's a tacit understanding that you just leave those at the door. Otherwise, it would compromise the bilaterals that are happening in the background.
I think that's a really helpful point, because there's a question about everyone's going to be instrumentalizing, using it for their own ends, their own objectives. The question is, does that matter? And to kind of pick up on Bridget's point, if it can't do anything particularly bad and it can't do anything particularly much, does it matter if different actors take home different messages to different audiences? And if we're thinking about the concern of accession states about this being a replacement, that if there's not actually any way you can make it a replacement, does that actually play out? But again, I think the case of Sunak is interesting, because as the organisers of next year's possibly meeting, is that a danger there? And how does that play out? No, it's really good for my steps. It makes me very happy I had that fry this morning.
Thank you. Helen Drake from Loughborough University, London. I guess it's a bit mainly for you, Ben. I thought we could indulge a little bit of creative thinking on France and Macron, and thinking about be careful what we wish for. So you're right about the NR and so on, but in many ways, Macron travels with little to no baggage, right? He's got no majority party. He's got no re-election prospects. I know he shoots his mouth off, about these things. He'll probably leave politics after 2027, I would imagine. Maybe Macron's an opportunity when we think about who comes after him, or who might come after him. We could have not an enarch, far from it, somebody who would call himself a patriot, and could take France in a much different sort of dark direction. Macron has vaulted. I think he's cleared easily what Albrecht Sontag has called the prison walls of French foreign policy, despite what he says. His mind is very sort of elastic, isn't it? Plastic. I can't remember what the 4 walls are, but I think they're Gaullism, education, chivalry, and another one. And Sarkozy tried to do the same, but I think Macron, despite everything, he is in a different mold, and he's showed himself over Ukraine and currently sort of able to show this plasticity. And I mean, that's a negative as well, isn't it? What does he believe in? Who does he ally with? But he can move. He moves incredibly fast, doesn't he? The EPC is his favoured kind. I think you said that, Chloe. It's his favoured kind of setup. His favoured kind of gig. Look what he just did with all the parties in France. He kept them, didn't he, in a building until about 3 in the morning making them all talk to each other with no phones and no press and what have you. So the talking shop type forum is not. I agree with everything you say, and we've just talked about it as well, about, you know, the suspicion. But maybe we could also have a parallel sort of thinking track on France, given given Macron's lack of baggage. That's how I put it. Okay, off you go.
Thank you, Helen. I'm just going to pass it along this way.
Thank you, Maxine David, Leiden University. You've talked about expectations, but I've not heard too much about perceptions, and I'm particularly interested in the perceptions of others. And thinking about this do no harm, some of the harm might be in the perceptions of others. Equally, I think even if it does turn out to be, you know, as you say, potentially quite benign, if it doesn't do much, that might be doing quite a bit of harm to Europe as well, in terms of what it signals for to others as well. So I wonder if we could kind of come out of Europe a little bit and think a little bit about how this might be seen by others out in the world, and particularly those who don't really have our interests at heart. Thank you.
Just because you get an award. Let's start with Jannike.
Yeah, just to pick up maybe on the Macron one. I do agree that Macron, because I guess he knows he's not going to be re-elected. This is his last term, and probably he's also driven kind of by the desire to leave some sort of legacy. That means that he's very interested in kind of driving the EPC forward now. I guess it just kind of means that in the longer term perspective, if in the next election in France, someone is elected who's less pro-European, that spells trouble for the project. But it also made me think that that is equally true for other countries. And we have other elections coming up in Europe, for example, in Slovakia, where there might be a government elected that is going to be not only less pro-European, but less supportive of Ukraine. So I think there might be kind of trouble down the road if there is less unity within the European Union in terms of supporting Ukraine, which would probably have spillover effects for the EPC, and would then also play into that point of kind of how is it perceived by others? How credible is the EPC as an organization that expresses solidarity with Ukraine? I guess that's true for dynamics within the EU, but also other members of the EPC who maybe aren't as black and white when it comes to support for Ukraine, and that then is maybe a weakness of the kind of very broad membership of the club. Whilst it also brings strengths, it is a weakness in that regard, I guess. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. I think that's an important corrective. I think you're right, and it does raise the issue in terms of what Macron now wants to do with this over the next couple of years. It will be fascinating to see if he does use it in that much more creative and facilitative way. To Maxine's point, that's an important question. I'll have to think about that one. And it comes a little bit back to Mark, but I don't know if anybody else has recognized the EPC and its existence yet. And I just wonder, thinking out loud, whether there's any link here between the EU's pursuit of like-minded partners globally, you know, the American idea of a conference of democracies, Congress of democracies. I mean, into the bigger even geopolitical conversations about, you know, where does liberal democracy go? Do we need to sort of coalesce one another? And maybe this is the European coalescing around liberal democratic values. I don't know, but it'll be fascinating to see how it works out. Again, so much is dependent on where this organization, institution, or framework goes, and it'll be fascinating to watch.
I know it wasn't exactly your point, Maxine, but I mean, we have a very nice example of where you can have such an initiative that has a set of ambitions and ends up being less successful than it might have been, which is the Barcelona process and the Union for the Mediterranean, which was, a huge investment. It was also certainly it was also a French presidential initiative as well. We've ended up with a project which is been less than the sum of its parts, frankly. And I would have thought from that perspective, particularly from the neighbours who are not in the EPC process, I mean, there must be a view that, look, we have our project, which is now even moving further back in terms of the order of priority, and actually we're now seeing as the problem rather than part of the solution in terms of managing migration and so on and so on. And there is this nice new shiny project in which we don't seem to have any kind of a place or a space. So I think there's something definitely to be thought about there. And there is, as we've touched on, the US issue that when we get to the UK hosting, we could be very close to seeing a Trump presidency. And so you can imagine in that summit then, there's going to be the topic of conversation between all the heads of state and government outside the room, because it won't be on the agenda, is how we're going to manage this, how we're going to cope, what does it do, not just for those who are sort of well ensconced in existing European institutions where we'd have anxiety about that, but what does it mean about the US in general? It's thinking about Europe and the major order political challenge we have in Europe, such as the war in Ukraine. So I mean, that that could end up having quite a different complexion because of the the backdrop to that. And of course, we may well have a new British Prime Minister at that summit. So whatever pair of slippers Mr. Starmer might be wearing, they're probably not going to be the same size, the same fit, and the same look in his ambition for the summit as they would be obviously for Mr. Sunak. So I mean, there's going to have to be, thankfully not by us, but by the civil servants, some sort of adroit footwork maybe to change the ambition for that summit from what it might have been for the UK to what it will be. So that will also be fascinating and interesting to watch, to see how that gets retooled. So I think, I'm actually through this session and thinking about it. I think the EPC is a lot more interesting actually than I thought it was, and throws up actually a lot more, a lot more sort of acute issues than I thought were actually was the case. So it shows the value of having a mind meld of us rather than just Macron's brain thinking about these things. He might have approached them a slightly different way.
No, I'll just add that I was also thinking about Union pour la Méditerranée, so the Mediterranean Union, and Sarkozy being, but I don't know how that fits in, but how that would be perceived. It's something that would really be worth looking into. And yeah, again, if one of those, if the migration issue is pushed, that also would shift things again, especially in light of the unrest in sub-Saharan Africa too. So, and what that may mean for movement of people, and how that's going to be discussed in this summit. So yeah, it's something to really look out for. But I kind of agree at the moment, nobody's really paid attention to it. Perhaps Russia has? I don't know.
Thank you very much. And if the panel and the audience think it would be useful, I'm happy to write an email to the Elysee on behalf of the association to say that we've been thinking about Macron a lot today. Just maybe as a final thought, just, we've had lots of metaphors around EPC. Maybe what this is a pop-up, that we've set up something, we're trying something out. maybe it turns into a more permanent kind of thing. Maybe it goes away and we wonder why we ever took the time to devote a plenary to it. Can I say, first of all, thank you to all four of our speakers for their contributions. I can also, just as a reminder, as a chair of an association which has an annual conference with lots of talking, we're not going to fall into the trap of not delivering on that. So can I just remind you that we have wonderful editors of wonderful journals. Here we've got UK and Changing Europe, who provide another great pathway for you to capture the conversations from today and from all of the panels. Yeah, so if you can join me in giving a round of applause to these four, I'd be very grateful.